Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch,
And I'm Troy Norcross.
and we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Wicked Podcast. Today I'm talking to Karen Meager, the co-founder and CEO of Monkeypuzzle Training, and we will be talking about leadership training, in particular the psychological aspect of it, and what it takes in today's organization to be a productive leader for the future. And I'll hope you enjoy the interview. Before the interview, a quick word from our very first sponsor, Zencaster. We use Zencaster for all our audio and video recording, and it's a very nifty tool that splits up all the channels for very easy editing. Zencaster is used by 10% of all active podcasts. You can get 40% off the first 3 months and unlimited audio and video recordings with our special coupon code WICKEDPODCAST. I repeat, Wicked Podcast for 40% off. And now the interview. Hello everyone, today we're here with Karen Meager. Hey Karen, and nice to have you.
Hi, lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So as usual, we always start at the top. So please tell our audience who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm Karen Meager. I run a training and consulting organisation called Monkeypuzzle Training and Consultancy, and I'm also a co-author of Real Leaders. And we basically do organisational psychology, so coaching, leadership development, training, and everything in between when organisations just need a bit of help on the people side of things.
Wonderful. So there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of things in your book, and I think the main thing how you book is structured. You have different areas of characteristics or skill sets that you explain leaders should have, and I'd like to drill down into some of them, and maybe just to start a little bit with awareness, which is quite one. Me personally, having worked with leaders as well and with teams and seeing how the communication is there and how leaders understand what the teams are doing, what the rest of the organization is doing, and or how not so much. So, if you could elaborate a little bit from your experience in awareness, in particular, I'm curious awareness of an organization, of a leader. Really being able to see root problems and not just symptoms, and what's your sort of definition of awareness, or how to be more aware as a leader. What does it mean to you?
Well, in a way, it's kind of really simple, but the actual doing it, I think, for leaders is often quite complex. So, we coming from so my background is in clinical psychology work. So we work an awful lot with people on like what are they aware of in terms of their own behaviors and their feelings to certain things that are happening in their environment. And often in my clinical work, I've been very much training people to kind of like to really observe what they're observing and hear what they're hearing, and particularly if you think about things like someone throws something out in a meeting and then like everybody's just got a completely different interpretation of what that person has just said. So sometimes the work is in drilling to like what did they actually say, like did they actually tell you to do that thing, like what were their exact words. So some of it is just putting like the pause button between some of the automatic responses that a lot of leaders have. And I mean, you're right in that the more senior you are in an organization, often the harder it is to be truly aware of some of the root causes. You're quite far away often from what's on the ground. But often you're also moving too fast to notice. So you can actually, I believe, pick up quite a lot by just sort of slowing down some of your own processes and reading the room. Like I mean, we've probably all been in meetings where you're thinking to the person speaking, just read the room,
Yeah.
because you're picking up cues all the time from whether people are switching off or whether they're engaged, and sometimes we need to help leaders, I think, to just retrain some of those automatic responses that they have, that help them to gather more data and just make some better judgments around what's actually going on, rather than sort of whatever feeds the story they're making up in their heads. I mean, people aren't doing this deliberately, but it becomes a learned behavior in organizations, particularly ones that are moving quite fast.
Yeah, and I think that sounds really interesting, because I think as you essentially mentioned, there's a part that's behavior, and there's another part that for me rings a bell on. Sometimes these behaviors are based, they're by design, right? So certain organizations have a particular culture, and you have certain behaviors that are allowed or fit into it, and some people are prone to align to them too much. And I've
Yeah,
just seen it in a project last year where we started working quite startup style, but before we knew it, we were just dragged into a behavior that is just more slow and convoluted and is not focused enough. And we had to pull back the teams themselves. So how how as a leader then do you do it? You said like slowing down, and that always sounds, which sound is a great idea, to step back and do more active listening. How do you really guard yourself as a leader, maybe especially when you're under your same level peers and you have the decision to make and have to bring finance and other bits and pieces together? How do you do that best then there, in terms of really being able to slow down? Because in a lot of experience I have with companies, everything used to be happening yesterday. There is no time to further reflect often. So slowing down things is what no one really wants to hear. As much as, like people say they fail fast, but actually no one wants to really see failure. What are some of the tricks or some of the maybe behavioral aspect, because that's what you mentioned. What are some of those that you then tell leader to explore in the dynamics?
well, I think some of it doesn't need to look like it's slowing down. So one of the things that we see an awful lot of is people trying to cram too much into one meeting, as an example of like a decision making process. So, and that just forces everybody into their automatic behaviors, whatever they are, their automatic reactions, their automatic ways of raising objections, and all of the usual kind of patterns. Whereas if you really carefully boundary a meeting to be about exploration, and you kind of boundary out anything else, and then you have another one that's a follow-up, like a short time afterwards, that's about making the decision when people have had time to reflect. Sometimes breaking things up in that way and boundarying them not overly prescriptively but quite carefully can enable leaders to like reflect on what was going on in that meeting, what were the dynamics, things like who was the quiet person in the room, because
Mhm.
sometimes the quiet person in the room is the one that's got quite creative answers, but it's not necessarily, as my partner says, the person speaking is not always the most competent person.
Yeah.
So it gives them a bit of a step change, so they can. So sometimes you can design your way around that, and some of the organizations that we work with that I guess we would consider to be the fastest, sort of break down their collaboration process in a way that like facilitates certain types of thinking. And I think
Mm.
that can help leaders with awareness, because it gives them a small opportunity to step back, but probably enough to move things forward, and also just not to fall into bad habits.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting how that dynamic plays out between peers. So moving that then and then saying, right, so that's on that level, or you talked a bit more top level in that line. But if we say, so the other thing I also observed often is then, even so, the leaders who actually I saw are fairly good at this, really listen, really make time. What then often I saw is that because of some hierarchical efforts or managers in place, when actually, C-level people actually take the time to talk to teams, so to speak, on the ground, there's often still a barrier between it because of management or the managers of the team sort of holding things back, or it's not quite built. Um, what's sort of the behavior or the tricks and things that you tell leaders there in order to, let's say downwards, kind of express a more bigger openness, no idea is wrong, or, to speak up when you just mentioned, who's the quietest person in the room. That is often instigated by sort of mid-level management sometimes, and there's often a knowledge barrier there. How can a leader sort of overcome that, given the targets of the roles?
Yeah, I mean, it is a tricky one, I think, particularly in organizations that are quite heavily layered, and where the culture is very much that you sort of stay within your hierarchical boundaries. And we work with quite a lot of tech organizations where the
Mhm.
boundaries are
Yeah.
much looser, and you can see. in those sort of organizations where it becomes much more um, acceptable for like C-suite people to just kind of gate crash a meeting and ask a few
Yeah.
questions, and or even just go and sort of sit next to somebody randomly. I mean, it can be terrifying, but
It
most of
can
them are
be.
like good people, so it's easy to kind of build the rapport that like builds that trust, and they're sort of also genuinely interested in what they're hearing. When I used to work in the fund management industry, which was where I started out, it was much more formal.
Mm.
And a lot of the leadership there used to do kind of those. I know it's quite old fashioned now, but it's still brilliant. The sort of forced back to the floor type exercises where,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, yeah.
the directors would come and take phone calls from clients, or that can be quite powerful if people are open to it. But I think also, I mean, and I'm sure you've come across this as well, it's just that I often think that, I mean, this our book's about leaders, but I think that the training of managers is often overlooked by organizations as like less important. But actually, the leaders that sort of sit in the middle, the managers that sit in the middle, um, they're often kind of great enablers or great blockers by
Mm.
design, and that can
Yeah,
be really challenging, I think, for the sort of just the way that people can move through change and get things to get to better decisions and that kind of thing. And it's not really necessarily our area of expertise, but particularly around the pandemic and after,
mm,
we're seeing a lot less investment in basic kind of management skills, which
yeah,
is either meaning that managers sort of run around after whatever they think the leader wants, or what we're seeing like increasingly more of is the workforce is kind of pushing managers to almost be kind of servants and run around after them. So they're
yeah.
sort of like, who would want to, like, it's again to the point where you're almost thinking who would want that job, because they're just, it's such a tricky place being stuck in that middle. But it can be very powerful if those people are adequately skilled and motivated.
Yeah, definitely, and I've seen this, and I think especially talking about this, you know, you could see some of those things existing pre-COVID, but COVID has really sort of emphasized and maybe loaded even more on middle management to the level where no one seemed to have much
Yeah.
investigated what does it mean, and then at the same time, it has created a new ways of working by choice or not, where you suddenly have a different context, but there's no bigger courses or something really or thought process there where I saw a lot of people adjust to it or have a look at it and go, how different is this? Is it just about someone being in the office or not, or does the management style need to change? So it's just really interesting, and I think that gets me then nearly
Yeah.
to motivation. Maybe not on the leader, but I start again with middle management because it's sort of the connecting block between those things. And so motivation is always fun, interesting, especially with bigger companies. Because if you're looking at some of the studies from McKinsey or someone that always say, the workforce is not as engaged. As a leader, you always should be massively engaged, very motivated. Um, do you think there's a thing where, how does it connect between the leadership motivation and let's say the middle management, which we often find just managing upwards, but being equally motivated to maybe towards the teams? Do you think there's a gap, or can the leader actually do something to middle management to proxy that motivation? How do you best sort of tell me a bit about the motivation aspect and that characteristic, please, and how that translates?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things that when I was studying um, motivation in sort of an academic sense, um, I know something that I kind of, when you know something, but then you hear it and you think, oh God, of course that's true.
Mm.
Um, that people like we were talking about, that people are motivated. Like otherwise, you just wouldn't
Yeah.
get out of bed. But the question is, what are you motivated by? And also that idea that motivation is inside a person, not necessarily. It can be brought forward by external factors, but if you want to keep somebody motivated, they've got to be motivated to do it themselves. And probably my team tell me that the number one question they get on training programs is, how do I get so and so to do the thing I want them to do?
Yeah.
And our answer is like you can't make them, but you can try to understand what interests them and what drives them, and try to provide them with meaningful work. And I think that's one of the things that leaders can do. If I'm working or coaching someone in a leadership position, then I think if you are a leader that is just sort of like waiting for your bonus or waiting for the
Mm.
next promotion, then you're not living a particularly fulfilling life in itself. And so, can you find a role that provides some meaning for you? And usually, people, like, if people think about it, they can they can find that. Like, it doesn't matter if they think that the work of the organization is not particularly exciting to them, but they could be excited by the people aspect. Or for some people, the work of the organization they're hugely passionate about, and that provides them with a lot of meaning. Um, but it's not always easy to meet everybody's instinctive motivational drivers, partly because some people are just not aware of what they're really motivated by. So often the tools that we kind of end up using are a little bit surface level. And that's why I think one of the sort of major tools for managers and leaders is to try to understand your like where your people are coming from as much as possible. But that
Yeah.
takes quite a lot of time, what you may not have. And it may be an interest that you don't have. Like, it's all right for me to sit here and say, like, you really need to understand your people and stuff, but I care about people. Like, people are
Yeah.
my whole thing. But that's not the same for everybody. So, like, I have to understand that for some people the process is more important, or the system is more important, or the outcome is more important. But there's usually something, if you look hard enough, that can give people an intrinsic sense of purpose that will keep them going on the hard days.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because it always reminds me of McGregor's is a System X and System Y. The kind of theory that some managers think you need to manage people, otherwise you're not going to do work, and the other philosophy or the other theory says actually everyone wants to have purpose in their job, wants to do a good job, and if you manage too hard, you're in the way. And it's tricky, as you said, um, and maybe that goes to your point of that managers should be trained more on this to manage people or manage differently, just more enabling them and more understanding what they're there. Because I've seen the same thing where, for me, often people split into two camps. One are the more practical people, and the other one are more the thinking people, right? And if you have them in the wrong way or push the wrong stuff on them, they just reject and they just try to work around it because they're not feeling
Yes.
comfortable enough with that. And then understanding that in itself is often quite crucial. Um, so, but do you think, I wonder if it's motivation, but it plays, maybe it plays into motivation, the next question. So, which is, there's just one quarter one saying, which is, don't come to me with problems, come to me with solutions. And I want to ask you how outdated you feel that is and how it plays into that, because it seems to be still around in a lot of management levels and leader levels to have sort of that attitude in them, and they translate that or they project that a lot. um, is that still a thing? Is it totally outdated? Do you still see it a lot or not, or does it show up in different ways, and what do you think about it?
Well, I think we still see it sometimes, but we're usually quite keen to take it take it on if we see it. Um, because the question that we would ask is, if you don't want to hear about the problems, then where are the bodies buried? Because, like, people won't bring stuff to you. But I guess, like, if you step behind, like, what's behind that question, and where I think a lot of leaders came up with that line, was that they felt like they were often just getting dumped with all the problems,
Yeah.
and people were just like moaning and whinging at them. So you can almost understand why they're like, well, come to me with something, some solution to it. So I can understand the reason behind, like, why leaders kind of got to that place where they just felt like they were being dumped on. And I think, if you think about leadership in the world generally, that the expectations of leaders are just unrealistic in terms of, like, the level of perfection they are expected to behold. Um, so I think, but I don't see so much the like the sort of blanket block of like I don't want to hear the problems. I think a lot of the good work that's been done in organizations around diversity and inclusion, psychological safety, that kind of thing. I mean, some people say that those things are that particularly psychological safety is a bit of a sort of fashionable buzzword, but
Mm.
the giving space for people to be able to speak up about things and not feel afraid is helping organizations to just be a bit more open, but also leaders understanding that they don't have to deal with every problem that's been brought to them. Like there are some problems that you're just not going to solve, and some of the responsibility and skill of a leader is which ones are you going to leave and which ones are you going to go after, because you
Yeah.
can't do them all. And sometimes I think when leaders get really confident, they know when to draw that line. Like, I appreciate you bringing me your concern, and it's not something that I can do anything. I'm going to do anything about at the moment.
Do you think there is a level that leaders would need to learn on how to filter? Because there's all sorts of obviously different levels of problems that can occur, especially in bigger companies. Anything from day-to-day stuff that a team should be able to just do themselves, make a decision and go, and no one gets bothered. And a lot of people do a lot of stuff. They make decisions all day through without thinking, oh, I need to talk to my manager about it, or I need to talk to, we need to elevate that somewhere else on a higher level. um, has that changed over the years, you reckon? That, are different levels of these kind of decision making levels need to happen? Because if I look at leaders now, and coming from a maybe a bit of system thinking, design thinking background, to look at these things that are so complex, for me it feels a small group of C-level people are less and less able to actually make a clear decision, because it is just so complex. There's so many scenarios, and and you try to whittle it down to like some bottom line numbers, and that's all you're basing it on, which feels very flawed. There's a lot of missing there in terms of information that people can make a decision on. How much have you seen this as a as a leadership characteristic? Is the decision making still the same? Do they need to improve it, or do they need to let go more of it? What's that part of a leader you see and maybe
I
needs
think
to change?
it depends on depends on the organization for me. Um, the I think where you've got a founder-led organization, you have a slightly different culture because the person's attachment to their thing is very strong. And then in those organizations, rightly or wrongly, I think that it's like they almost have a right to have big, the big call decisions probably do still sit with them. Um, but in a more traditional kind of shareholder type structure, or like a different corporate structure, then the it is complex, you're right. And I think that the problems happen because everyone's trying to do a lot of things, but they're not necessarily thinking everything through. Like, as they say in the army, time spent on a recce is never wasted, but organizations don't
Mhm.
seem to um, spend enough time practicing things and building sort of skills and capabilities. And I think in the past, like in the old, I said the old days, in my old days, a lot of middle management, middle leadership was more of a translation job. Your role was basically to translate downwards and upwards. But now the complexities are so hard to get your head around that no one really ever knows whether they've made the right decision. So some of it, I think, is getting the right level of definition of responsibilities at different roles, so that people are people often sort of die a little bit inside when you say you need to write a clear job description, but sometimes these, if they're written well and they're crafted in collaboration with the person, it does set a really useful boundary of, this is where my decision making plateau is, and this is where yours is, and there might be some point where we overlap and we have to discuss things. But I think that those things became just admin, but they can be hugely powerful in terms of helping people at all levels to understand what their psychological contract with their organization is, and what they're going to be held accountable for. and particularly when we're working much more virtually, managers can't watch people all the time, and neither should they. Those kind of levels of clarity, I just think, are essential, but we're just not really. I'm not seeing organisations putting enough time into those types of things, because they're sort of foundations rather than anything that's kind of exciting or sort of driving in that respect. But it pays off. It pays off in the long run. I guarantee it.
I bet it does, and I can see a lot of that, because it can trickle down easily as well when you don't have clarity, and at the top it trickles down into very lack of clarity further down as well, and before you know it, no one knows what actually to do and how to go about it. So I want to touch a bit then on relationship as well, because if you start doing that and you talk about roles and responsibilities, either on a peer level or on other management layers. So in terms of relationships, I found that a lot of the success of change or bigger projects are based on communication. Communication is sort of a way of building relationships, either with your peers or with the teams that makes the organizations and the departments and whatnot. What do you see in terms of relationship building as a skill set, and how what aspects and behaviors play best into that as a leader?
So one of the main things that I would advocate for is that don't learn communication just as a skill. Now, you need to learn how to build relationships, and that's quite different. So just sort of kind of learning some language and some language patterns and some things to say and some hints and tips, they can be useful, but if they're not really um, who you are, then you can
No.
often find yourself moving further and further away from what feels right for you. um, and also you just come across as like fake for other people. And I'm not kind of like a big fan of the word authenticity, because sometimes I think that's just an excuse to dump your view on somebody else without
Yeah.
thinking about what you're doing.
All right.
So like I'm not going that, but I think you need to still stay kind of near enough to your personality. So a lot of the a lot of the work that we would do with people around relationships is about boundaries and where the boundaries are drawn between the relationships. So, like we're working with an organization at the moment who had a very kind of family. It was a very much like kind of the culture of a family,
Mm,
and it grew and grew and grew very, very quickly to the point where you couldn't really run quite like that anymore. Um, and and yet people felt really overly responsible for other people in the organization, to the point where they kind of mind read, like so and so's upset and therefore there might be a
mm,
flight risk, and so you'd end up with everybody kind of getting involved in everybody's business, not encouraging
mm.
people to speak up for themselves.
Oh, okay.
And that can then become, it feels kind of really friendly, but it can also become quite toxic, because you're not
Yeah.
empowering people, you're just like coddling them and stuff. And then and they've done a lot of work in terms of shifting the clarity around, this is my responsibility and this is your responsibility, and I can support you but I'm not going to kind of rescue you, that kind of stuff. um, that can take quite um, a lot of heat out of the relationships, is when you're understanding the boundaries. But a lot of us are not, unless we're brought up by exceptional parents, and not often taught how to naturally kind of do boundaries, because you're brought up in a family household where people are always trashing each other's boundaries, and that's just how it goes. And then you go out to work and you're expected to
Yeah.
like to hold firm on these things. It's not always like easy to do.
Yeah. Um, we always have more questions than time, so here's sort of the last sort of bigger one or wrap up for it. Um, if you look at the news and the world out there, it seems that we have a bit of a leadership crisis. And I don't know if that's just the bias from the news being after the big headlines, but we look at a lot of government leaders, and sadly as well, some of the better ones like Miss Arden just stepped down because the job, she said, like, it's just too much pressure, and she wants to do a good job and she doesn't want to burn out and then do a bad job, which is another actually positive trait and decision she made there, being don't want to say authentic, but like a very grown up decision, which we haven't seen in a lot of leaders here in the UK, US, or there's a lot of the bigger countries that just don't show that. The same goes with Elon Musk, and where things just seem really mad, and the main characteristic seems to be they're all very disconnected, the bad ones. Do we have a leadership crisis that is sort of disconnected? What are your thoughts on that, and why do you think disconnection is a thing? If it's a thing, I might be wrong on that, but what are your thoughts on that?
It reminds me, I think, was it a Billy Connolly joke where he said that the fact that you want to be a leader should automatically disqualify you from being in the role.
Sounds like a
And
Marx
I
Brothers
think like
joke.
sometimes in politics, yeah, probably he got it from there, I'm sure. Um, the um, the problem that you have though is that I think there's a slight difference between organization, of a lot of organizations and politics, in
Mm,
that the amount of power and um, perceived adoration that comes with a political post is um, often it like attracts a certain type of person. But I think, well, I'm probably an optimist in that I think it is beginning to die out a bit. In
mm,
that there are more and more. I mean, you mentioned Jacinda Ardern, and we would never even have like heard of that like
mm,
5 years ago, 10 years ago, probably. No one would have thought wouldn't have made the news. So I think we are beginning to sort of see different people coming through, and if you sort of buy into some of the Generation Z type theories that are coming, what there's no way those people are going to work for people
mm.
that are
Yeah.
power hungry, bad actors, that kind of thing. But I
Mm,
guess you're always going to have, there are always going to be, because it's kind of a personality type, that there are going to be people that feel the only way that they're going to feel safe and happy and secure in the world is to have the maximum amount of power, and then
mm,
that becomes
yeah.
an insatiable need. We see that with someone like Donald Trump, like this doesn't matter how much power he has, he just wants more and more.
Yeah.
And that you are going to have those people. I think that the challenge for society is that the pull for us all to be much more understanding and vulnerable and supportive. How do you deal with those people? Because they are not going to respond to that. And I
Yeah.
think that is one of the the challenges, and one of the things that we often say to people we're working with is, you're a good person, I want you to lean into your power. Like, where is
Mm,
your power, and where can you use it for good? But yeah, but that
mm,
is, you need those people really stepping up, because otherwise the people that seek it for the status and the power are just probably going to always end up in those kind of roles, and I think that would just be a great shame.
yeah. True. Nice big wrapping of that conversation. Karen, unfortunately we're out of time. Thank you so much for all your thoughts and your answers, and thank you so much for being with us. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you. Bye.
You've been listening to The Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.